Welcome to Generations, a show which helps people 50 and better lead happy, healthy, and productive lives. Here's today's moderator, Gloria Van Demeltrot.
Hello, and welcome to Generations. We have a good show today that will be lots of fun, I suspect. I'm Gloria Van Demeltrot, and I'll be the moderator today. Let me first introduce my co-hosts. Here we have Nadia Jordana. Welcome, Nadia.
Hi, Gloria. I'm glad to be here today.
Oh, that's great. Good to have you. And we have Lynn Garthwaite, who is a delightful addition to our show today. Great to have you, Lynn.
Thanks. Nice to be sitting in. Thank you.
Wonderful. And our guest today is Chaelene Roemhildt, who is an expert, I would say, on genealogy. That's our topic for today. Welcome, Charlene.
Thank you, and I would quibble with expert because there are true experts. I'm experienced amateur is what I would call myself.
An experienced amateur.
Yes.
That works for me.
Excellent.
Yes, and an enthusiastic experienced amateur.
Yes.
Charlene, we're thrilled to have you on the show today.
Thank you.
Genealogy is something that has taken on a renewed interest in the world today, I really think, with the addition of DNA testing. Some of us have done it, and it has sort of moved this subject and made it more important in the public view, I think. So we're really happy to have you with us. Tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe how you got interested in genealogy.
Well, I'm a retired marketing and communications professional, and the writing aspect of that career helps me with the genealogy piece. I would say the other aspect is that I have a general interest in history, just any kind of history. And so personal history is one type of way to explore the past. And the other thing I think would be that I feel connected to something when I know about my ancestors. And I find it interesting to find out more about their lives and the kind of challenges that they faced and overcame and that kind of thing. So that's kind of where I've come from. I've been doing this casually for maybe 15 years. I found some things online that some other people had done, and I read those and started doing the research on my own probably 10 years ago. So.
Okay.
Did you come from a family that talked a lot about ancestors? Were there stories?
No, not at all.
Okay.
My dad, on my dad's side of the family, I think I could count on one hand the comments he ever made about his family.
Interesting.
Really?
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
And on my mother's side, her parents were both products of blended families. So I was always confused about these like half brothers and stepsisters. And so I kind of finally put that together through my research. Actually, it was kind of interesting to see how all the pieces fit.
Yeah.
So.
Interesting.
Interesting.
Do you think there's a reason to be concerned because of all the DNA testing now? Is there, should we worry that somebody out there is stockpiling all this information to be used in whatever way we don't know?
Well, that's a question that you have to ask yourself when you decide to take one of these tests and send the results in. I have not done it myself. I have privacy concerns about it. Where does this data go? Does the company that I'm sending it to resell it to third parties?
Okay.
And so that's been my hesitation. I know there are a lot of people who are very enthusiastic, and one of the things that does come out of it is that you find people that you are related to that found you because they did their DNA also.
Right.
And these are like fifth cousins that you
Right.
never have found any other way.
Right.
So that there's pluses and minuses,
Sure.
I would say.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I have a DNA interesting point that I learned recently, and maybe you can confirm it, is let's say, and I'll use Irish for an example because it's easy to relate to. You've got 2 or 3 sisters or brothers in a family, and one feels like he can really relate to the Irish in his blood, and another relates to the other side of the family. And I recently learned that that's more than just in your head that there really is different DNA in different people, and one sibling can be more Irish than the other.
That is interesting, and that shows us how, again, there are privacy issues. I've done it myself, and it was really fun to see, And I know my brother has, but we haven't compared yet.
Right,
We haven't had a chance to do it. Can you tell us, Charlene, how you got started in doing this and what you did when you did get started?
Well, as I said, I found some things that people had they'd done the research and posted their results online. And these were people that I came to trust the research that they had done. You know, they were thorough and meticulous about documenting facts. And so I was able to read a number of histories of families, especially on the Roemhildt side, that were done fairly early. And so I said, wow, how did they know that? Where did they get that? So then you start to get into looking at census records and birth records, and it's kind of one of those things where you're pulling on a thread, and then you find another and another, and so it gets to be like a detective story. And for me, I always wanted to do it seriously. And you can be a hobbyist and kind of just look around and have some fun with it. I wanted to know for sure what I had. And in that case, I decided I was going to redo the research myself in many cases. And my standard of proof is 2 documents that say the same fact, if at all possible. You can't always, but so that got me into, you know, trying to find the same birth date for a great-grandfather in 2 places. And so as you start to get into this, you start to find the databases that have all of these documents, and hopefully they're images of the documents themselves, not just extracts. And so then you can start to pull things together and piece things together that way.
Wow.
So.
That'd be fascinating. That'd be cool. How about if, I've thought at different times, you know, when you walk in like one of those really old cemeteries and you see names on the tombstone, it'd be interesting to find out more about that person. But if all you know when you start is the information that's on a tombstone, are you likely to find much?
Sure. Probably there is a huge database. I think they have at least 1 billion records now. It's called 1 billion records worldwide. It's called Findagravecom.
Oh,
no
okay.
spaces.
Oh, okay.
And they have compiled, like I said, 1 billion, maybe, of tombstones and inscriptions, and so you could find there the name that you read.
Right.
In many cases, someone has done some work to post who were their parents, how are they related to other people in the cemetery.
Right.
And that's stuff that you'll have to check out, because these people are going by like newspaper obituaries or what have you, or they might put in that assumed relationship. They'll say the father of this person was named such and such, and that's assumed relationship. But you can start there.
Okay.
And if you go into any of the major databases, which everybody I think has heard of, Ancestry, Family Search, Find My Past, and My Heritage are the 4 big ones. There's literally hundreds of databases. But if you took that name and typed that in a search in Ancestry, you would find a lot.
Oh, that'd be fun.
Yeah.
That'd be fun. Another mystery type
Another
thing.
mystery.
Because you want to know,
Yes.
all we know is that they're buried there. but,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
There's an awful lot of, I think, an interest in history. I think people who work with genealogy and their family are interested in that family history. What are some of the things that they get out of it that's above and beyond the facts and things to share with other family members?
Right. I went to a conference, and one of the presentations I heard was, don't be a BMD genealogist, birth, marriage, death. You know, you find names, you find dates, and that's it. For me, especially, these were living people what was happening in their lives. I mean, I think about my great-great-grandfather, Friedrich Johann Theodor Ewert.
Oh, wow.
He and his wife and 3 boys and her parents all came in 1865, left from Hamburg. Why?
Oh.
What was going on in
yes,
Germany?
why?
Why is this going to be a better life? They're coming in October of 1865, as I said, to a country where there's just been a civil war. The president has been assassinated. They're leaving behind everybody else that they knew in the old country.
Right.
You know, what is it that drives people to do these things? And what happened when they got here? And
Right.
and in his case, they landed in Chicago because there were some relatives living there, but then they moved on to Minnesota. Why?
Yeah.
Yes. Did you find out why?
I think the answer to that we've been able to kind of come up with is that he wanted to be a farmer. And in Germany at that point in time, it was almost impossible to buy land.
Okay.
You could not. And it was almost impossible to even inherit it. And so they, instead of staying in Chicago and working in the lumber yard like most of their other relatives had been doing, they decided to move to Minnesota. They each got 160 acres, he and his brother, and went from there. And so I think it was a thing of, this is my place and I want to build something here.
Right.
So that's,
Okay.
I think, what drove him.
That drove a lot of people. I've written a story, a history of the village of Lake Elmo, and how that started is very similar. And one thing I think we should mention is that in the old country, in Germany and some of the other countries there in Europe, the farm is inherited by the oldest son.
Right.
And the next sons get nothing. They have to start their own lives or do something else. And those second and third sons are the ones who came to United States. And Minnesota is so similar to Germany, for example, that many of them settled here. But that was the impetus for them to go. They wanted land, and there was no more land, as you said, in Germany. Yeah.
And yeah, probably the place they pick has a lot to do with where they left. Like you said, it's so similar. My ancestors are all from Scandinavia, and so Minnesota reflected probably the weather, the layout, the farming, that kind of thing. And so I think that's kind of how they find their way. But great questions, because most people don't think to ask why.
Yeah.
And it gives you a chance to do a little history.
Yeah.
Look up some things about other parts of the world that you probably didn't know before.
Do you write those up in stories then?
Yes, I do. And there's actually, for the Ewert branch of my family, which is my mother's father's side, myself and 2 co-authors / researchers did a book, and each line has its own chapter, and we have so much information, it just barely fits in a 4-inch binder.
Oh my
A
goodness.
4-inch binder.
A 4-inch binder.
Wow.
That's fascinating.
And my notion is, okay, you have all these facts and you have the documents to support the facts, but make it come alive. Make it be something where you can picture someone,
Right.
Buying a piece of land and bringing their family and, creating another life and getting involved in, and that side of the family. They were all involved in government on the township level.
Okay.
So they were like the town treasurer for Alton Township in Waseca County, Minnesota, that sort of thing. And so you can start to see how they developed their lives and how through the generations. In that case, so it was a lot of civic involvement, and you can just see that's a trait
Right,
on that side. So.
And probably if they're involved in those kind of things, you might find like old newspaper articles or something that might mention them
Yes.
because they have in a small town.
Yes.
I have a great-great-great-grandfather who was superintendent of schools in a very small town. And so he shows up in the newspaper periodically.
Yes.
So that's
Yes.
nice. Yeah.
What kind, I know that we have some images to show, and can you talk about some of those, the papers and things that you have found?
And again, you know, because we're at this point in time, there's just an amazing amount of stuff available online. But don't neglect going to the places, going to county courthouses, cemeteries, churches. County historical societies will have copies of documents, usually on microfilm. And what you'll find there is a whole host of things. I have the ship manifest for Friedrich Johann Theodor and his family from 1865. I have census reports. There's been a U.S. census since 1790, and the census for all those years is available up to 1940. In 2 more years, we'll get the 1950 census data will start to come out. You know, and that gives you a sense of where they lived. It usually has occupation. In some cases, they ask different questions in different censuses. Can they read and write? In one case, it's like, were they blind? I mean, they asked all kinds of different questions. But you get the sense of, was anyone living with them? Did they have boarders? What kind of jobs did they have? How old were they when the census taker came that day? So census documents are available. You can find marriage licenses. I have one for my great-grandfather, Charles Ewart. And again, do not be discouraged if you don't find exactly what you're looking for, because there's transcription errors. A lot of these documents were handwritten. Many of them were in another language. And sometimes there's just no reason for the discrepancy, because my great-grandfather Charles Ewart, his actual name was Carl Friedrich Wilhelm. There's no Charles in it. But he went by Charles all of his adult life. But I have his marriage certificate to his first wife, Emma Gritzmacher.
Oh, my.
The names.
Yes, that's the
Gritzmacher.
nicest
Okay.
name, but yeah. Church records. I have a church record of the death of his wife Joanna, and it's in German, 1907. This was, and she died of old age, was what they said.
Old age.
And it gives some information about what the date she died, when she was buried, what she died of, and her survivors.
Okay. And in old age in those days was 45 probably.
Well, she was.
I
She
might
was
be
a little bit older,
exaggerating,
but yes, the lifespans were different. And then, of course, there's newspaper obituaries, which, if you're looking in larger cities, there are databases that specialize in that. If you're looking in smaller towns, you might need to go to a historical society and look at their microfilm. I have one for my great-grandfather on the other side, Henry Schrader, and this was in the 1929, so it's fairly far along in terms of completeness and the way people wrote up obituaries, because in some cases they got like one line. But interestingly enough, and again, you have to kind of have your wits about you, because in my great-grandfather Henry Schrader's newspaper obituary, it talks about his life and when he died and so on and so forth. And then it's starting to go through his surviving adult, obviously, children. And so it's listing, and then it says Mrs. Emma Dimmel, Mrs. Emma Dumdye. Well, they didn't have two girls and named them both Emma.
Right.
Yeah.
It was Mrs. Emma Dumdye, Mrs. Edie Dimmel.
Oh, so it was an error.
It was an error. And then it goes on to list Miss Christy Schrader of Chicago.
Oh.
that would be Mr. Christian
Oh.
William Schrader of Chicago.
So close. They're so close.
His family nickname was Christie.
Okay.
So you can picture the small town newspaper. He's
Yeah.
writing this down.
Christie, right.
Somebody's telling him, you know, so and so and so and so, and he's
Right.
writing it down to the best of his ability, and it kind of comes out a little bit skewed.
Yep.
So,
All right.
Well,
Wow.
and something
Caution.
I've noticed in our family is that we had a genealogist that did a really good job with all the old stuff. But there are gaps in recent history, you know, from when she stopped. And I did a little bit to fill in some, but I think it's good for people to remember, don't overlook modern documents. Make copies, even if it's your cousins and some other parts in the family, because not everybody's doing it. Because the gaps can come more recently now, and it's hard to fill those in. Maybe not as hard as it was for far back, but I've noticed that, and I'm glad that I'm making notes and writing
Yes.
things
Yeah.
down,
Yeah.
because you
Right.
think you're going to remember it forever.
yes.
Because it's modern.
Oh, I have many, many photos where it's of some of my relatives, but nobody bothered to write the names on the back.
Right.
I think because they thought, well, we know who we are. Why would I need to write that down? And they didn't, so we're still guessing.
That's true. I wanted to make a comment. We were talking about the census takers.
Right.
We have to remember that the census takers were people. And people have accents.
Yes.
And they have personal preferences in how they spell.
Yep.
And as well as
handwriting.
taking
Yes.
down the information.
Yes.
Many, many names were spelled wrong.
Yeah.
The gender was wrong in many of the census information. So you have to really read all of that with a grain of salt
Oh, yes.
because they might be incorrect. And some of those, by the way, the misspellings in the census records became the way their name was spelled forever.
Right.
Well, yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, because it was in all, they took it
Kind of
from
like
the
when they came over on Ellis Island. If it was
Exactly.
misspelled, that was just the way it was left.
Right,
yeah.
right.
But that's why you say get 2 documents
Yeah,
if you can.
Right.
And,
Back
you know, and don't look for the exact thing, because on the 1870 census for Friedrich, his last name is Ebert.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
instead of
Ewert.
Ewert. Yeah.
Yes, so
Okay.
it happens,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Charlene, I know that you have done a lot of work in uncovering your family. You did some work in a cemetery, and I'd like you to tell the story about that, if
Okay.
you would, please.
Okay. Well, this goes all the way back to when I first got interested in this, and you know, I had mentioned that the Roemhildts have been quite extensively researched by a number of people. There's a number of my relatives, distant and near, who have or are doing research on that branch. So there's a lot of stuff out there. And so I knew that my great-great-grandfather was Heinrich Roemhildt. And in one of the pieces that had been posted, it said something about a cemetery in LeSueur County in Minnesota, the Hagenstein-Sperber Cemetery. That's when I went to find the grave and found out exactly where it was.
Okay.
And I went there, and it's out in the country. And what had happened is that the early German immigrants in that area had started a log cabin church. A couple of the farmers had donated some land for this church and the cemetery, and they started a cemetery. And then the church burned down in 1867.
Okay.
So they decided to start over, and they built on a piece of property about a half a mile away, started a new cemetery. And so this little cemetery kind of got lost and orphaned and abandoned. And at one point, one of the people who lived in the neighborhood decided to put a fence around it as his Eagle Scout project.
Oh.
So it is in a grove of trees, but it does have the fence around it, which really helped preserve it from just being, you know, wild woods.
Right.
Well, so I found it. I found it in quite a tumble-down condition, as you might imagine, overgrown, trees falling in, all of that sort of stuff. And myself and a couple of my cousins cleaned it up. We painted the fence. That took 2 whole summers. sprayed for weeds, threw down some grass seed, and so now it's been restored, and I maintain it pretty much myself at this point. It doesn't take a lot. And the final piece to me is that we set a stone for Heinrich Roemhildt. Because in this little cemetery, there are 13 confirmed burials, but only 3 stones.
Oh, okay.
And so it was like, well, he's here. We know he's here
Somewhere.
somewhere. And so I decided he needed to have a stone.
Aw.
And I raised some money. I put some of my money in. And we find at the end of the day, we put his stone. And it was like, well, where? It's like, could be anywhere. There's no records. And there was a stone for Edward Geyer. Edward Geyer is some sort of distant cousin of mine who in 1863 got lost in a blizzard and died.
Oh, my.
He was 8 years old.
Oh, 8. Oh.
So I thought, well, he died in 1863. They would have buried him near his grandpa.
Yeah.
And so that's why I put Heinrich's stone next to Edward's.
Nice.
So-
Oh, it's a great story. And I love the fact that you're being forced to pronounce all these long German names.
I know.
What a great treat.
So what do you do with all this documentation? And do you print it out? What do you do with it?
Well, that's one of the things you kind of have to think about early on, is you're going to get a lot of stuff. And if you're not careful, you're going to have 20 million Post-it notes all over the place. And so there are forms online where you can start to record, you know, names, parents' names, place of birth, date of birth, children's names. And so you need to get going on some kind of routine, systematized kind of thing before it gets out of hand. But I would not go so far as to say to make it complicated and hard to maintain. Do what you need to do to keep it organized. And at some point you might want to migrate. There are software programs that are database managers where you can put all of this in and it links everything together. And you might want to get there at some point. But yes, this is also an organization challenge going
And you
forward.
end up with a 4-inch binder.
You could end up with a 4-inch binder if you're not careful.
Yeah. Good for you, though. That's amazing.
Charlene, this is fascinating, and I hate to be the bad guy, but we're running out of time, and there's so much more to talk about, I know. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, and our co-host, Nadia, thank you. This has been fascinating for you.
For me too, yes.
Great, great. And Lynn, it's been so nice to have you with us.
Thank you. Yes, and this was fabulous. This was very interesting. Thank you so much.
I think our listeners are going to enjoy it too, to start searching for your relatives and your families. Thank you for being with us on this episode of Generations. We'll see you next time.